My name is John Horgan. I'm a psychologist by training. I'm the director of the International Center for the Study of Terrorism at Penn State. We are a multidisciplinary center with psychologists, political scientists, economists, historians, computer scientists, and we conduct research on the social and behavioral aspects of terrorism. Our signature area is the psychology of terrorism. We're interested in issues to do with how and why people become involved in terrorism, what kinds of things people do as members of terrorist networks, and finally how and why people disengage from terrorism and in some cases even de-radicalize. And it's the subject of disengagement and de-radicalization that I've been invited to Madrid to speak about.
My name is Seth Jones. I'm a senior political scientist at RAND and an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in the Security Studies program. My focus here has predominantly been on Afghanistan and Pakistan, looking at militant groups operating in that area, including threats to the U.S. homeland, and trying to understand how groups like the Taliban or individuals within the Taliban reintegrate or reconcile, that is, switch sides.
I think one of the most immediate difficulties that I've seen is the challenge of setting realistic expectations. The idea of de-radicalization, I think, for some implies a quick fix, that people can almost be deprogrammed or unconditioned and moved from being involved in terrorism to somehow, not even having radical ideas. I found it much more practical to focus on identifying ways to enable disengagement as opposed to de-radicalization per se. In many of the cases of people whom I've interviewed who have left terrorist movements, they have disengaged, but they haven't necessarily de-radicalized. For many years, psychologists have been looking at the relationship between attitudes and behavior. We've actually found that attitudes are quite poor predictors of behavior. A person may have a very low risk of re-engaging in terrorism without necessarily having to change the way they actually think. But the assumption is we need to change the way people think in order to ensure that they won't re-engage in terrorism.
I think in addition to that, one of the challenges in some of the insurgent and terrorist groups I've looked at recently, especially ones in the midst of an active war, is security. It's basic security. If one is to disengage in the middle of a violent war, how can they be protected? Because what we've seen in the Afghanistan context, including individuals that I have interviewed or their family members, is if one cannot protect individuals that disengage, including publicly denounce their previous employers, whether it's the Taliban or other groups, they will actively be sought out and intimidated or assassinated. And we've had several cases of individuals that have been assassinated after they've defected. So part of, in addition to what John mentioned, in cases where there's an ongoing active war, there's also a very important component if somebody does decide to disengage or to defect, ensuring that their survival is facilitated. Well, I think when one looks at the threats to both Spain and the United States, there are clearly areas where they diverge to some degree. The Spanish face a threat from ETA, which is different from what the U.S. faces in some areas. The U.S. does not face an ETA threat, but at the same time, on the militant groups like Al-Qaeda, there are similarities, and threats emanating from areas like Pakistan are threats that both Spain faces and the United States faces. So I think in that sense there are commonalities. Now, Spanish forces, police, diplomatic, military forces are operating in Afghanistan. So are United States forces as well. So they certainly share in some key areas a need to cooperate and are doing it actually quite well on the ground. So again, threats in some cases may differ, but they are similar. And in areas where they're similar, like on the Afghanistan-Pakistan area, I think the cooperation has actually been quite good.
Sure. I mean, well, terrorism studies as an area of specialization for many scholars has actually been around since the very late 60s. But back then it was really dominated by just a handful of scholars. There was, prior to 9/11, there was quite little funding and resourcing available for research projects. And for the most part, dedicated terrorism scholars would fund research off the backs of other projects. Obviously, 9/11, the events of 9/11 changed all of that. We saw an avalanche of research. At one point, there was a new book on terrorism being published every 6 hours in the immediate time after 9/11. There is more since 9/11 that has been written about terrorism than even the most dedicated scholar could read in an entire lifetime. And one of the real challenges now is ascertaining what is the good quality terrorism research as opposed to poor quality terrorism research. So method, a respect for rigor, a respect for evidence, a respect for data represent the kind of hallmarks that distinguish good, proper, informed terrorism research from pieces that might simply reflect opinion. It's not to say that those aren't that the opinion-based pieces aren't valuable. Of course they are. But when we're talking about research, it's important for us to have a clear sense of what constitutes good research.
I think what's still interesting, though, is on a range of basic questions, including how terrorist individuals disengage or groups end or at least weaken, even almost a decade after September 11th. I mean, there is still a significant amount of research that needs to be done on answering very basic terrorism-related questions that the field, I think, is not entirely clear about answers to. So, despite the spotlight that has been shown on terrorism research, there still are a range of very important questions, I think, that do not have adequate and may never have adequate answers.
I mean, more terrorism research doesn't necessarily mean that we are automatically guaranteed more answers.
Thank you.